This lecture is made possible by an endowment by Rabbi Breger's family, and we have it here in Hillel. The director of Hillel, Michelle Blumenberg, is with us this afternoon, and it's part of the cooperative arrangement that Judaic Studies has with Hillel, that we hold lectures here, we offer classes here, and this is a facility that we're very, very privileged to be able to use. So we thank you for that opportunity to serve our campus and community through this building. I just have a few things to say regarding this lectureship series. Before coming to Tucson, Rabbi Breger distinguished himself as a learned and progressive rabbi. I don't mention it here, but just so that all know, he was the rabbi of Anshe Israel for many years. That will come up shortly. He served the Jewish community of the island of Rhodes as rabbi and Av Beit Din. He was also professor of Talmud at the island's renowned rabbinical seminary, which served the Jewish communities in the Balkans, Israel, Egypt, and Ethiopia. He served there from 1928 to 1938. Despite the seminary's relatively short history, it became one of the premier rabbinical seminaries serving the Sephardic communities across the region. After the closure of the seminary amidst the outbreak of anti-Semitism on Rhodes in 1938, Breger, his wife, Dr. Bertha Breger, and his daughter Leva were able to secure passage to the United States, eventually settling in Tucson. During World War II, he served in the U.S. Army, where his leadership skills naturally emerged, allowing him to rise through the ranks from private to major and becoming the highest-ranking Jewish chaplain in the Pacific Theater. After the war, he returned to Tucson, where once again his robust scholarship and inspired leadership enabled him to become the Southwest's leading rabbi. Apart from his long and most successful rabbinate at Congregation Anshe Israel, Breger was instrumental in founding many Jewish educational and communal organizations in Tucson and the Southwest. Among those many institutions was the Judaic Studies program here at the U of A, and beginning with a handful of students in just one Hebrew course and a single Judaic course, he built the program through the years. That program is now the Arizona Center for Judaic Studies. The center now has nearly 24 affiliated faculty, teaches hundreds of students each semester, serves dozens of majors and minors, presents dozens of academic and public lectures each year, and has an outreach program that engages over 3,000 people a year. In 2011, the center entered its next phase with the inauguration of a graduate program in Judaic Studies. So what Rabbi Breger started, the momentum continues to build. Rabbi Breger served both as a congregational rabbi and a serious scholar. He graduated from the Conservative Seminary in Breslau and published his dissertation in 1932. His lasting commitment to the University of Arizona and its Judaic Studies program is evident in the bequest of his personal library to the U of A library. It now is the cornerstone of the university's rabbinic collection. I can tell you we just hired a new faculty member in rabbinic studies, rabbinic literature. The person went into, this is Professor Dr. Max Strassfeld, went into the library, was looking at the collection, and was amazed at what was there at the University of Arizona. And the reason why it's there is because of Rabbi Breger. The Arizona Center for Judaic Studies is pleased and proud to present the Rabbi Dr. Marcus Breger Memorial Lectureship Series in his honor. May his memory continue to be a blessing for us all. It's our privilege to have his family here representing the long tradition of the Breger's family service to the University of Arizona and to this community. And we're very thankful that you're all here, even coming, David, from Israel for this lecture. It truly is an honor for us to offer this. Marshall Breger, our speaker today, is professor of law in the Columbus School of Law at the Catholic University of Arizona. Through the course of his long, pardon?
America. I wish it were Arizona.
Oh, did I say Arizona? Sorry. It says America here. I just... at the Catholic University of America. Sorry. We're planning one for Arizona. Through the course of his long and distinguished career, he has held many other leadership positions. Chairman of the Administrative Conference of the United States, an independent federal agency, alternate delegate of the U.S. to the UN Human Rights Commission in Geneva, special assistant to President Reagan, serving as his liaison to the Jewish community, solicitor of labor, the chief labor of the Labor Department under the George H.W. Bush administration, acting secretary of labor for labor management standards, senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation, Lady Davis visiting professor of law at the Hebrew University, distinguished Fulbright lecturer in the Philippines, and is currently a contributing columnist for Moment magazine and vice president of the Jewish Policy Center in Washington. Professor Breger writes and speaks regularly on issues such as constitutional law, arbitration, U.S. foreign relations, and the Middle East peace process. He has published over 25 law review articles. You can update that. Maybe it's changed since I wrote this last week. That's why I put over. In publications including the Stanford Law Review, Boston University Law Review, Duke Law Journal, and the North Carolina Law Review. He has also published in periodicals such as Middle East Quarterly, National Interest, Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and New York Times. He has testified more than 30 times before the U.S. Congress. The author of, I'm just going to say 6 books, author or editor of 6 books. Most recently, the Vatican Israel Court, Legal, Pontifical, and Theological Issues. And it is on that topic that we welcome him here today. The title of that talk, today's talk, is The Vatican Israel, Legal and Political Issues. Please join me in welcoming Professor Breger to our campus.
I have to thank Ed Wright, not only for this overmuch introduction, but also for inviting me here. Let me tell you, no matter how cold you think it's right now in Tucson, it's like a hot tub compared to Washington. And of course, I'm also extremely honored to be speaking at a lecture in the memory of Rabbi Marcus Breger. He was the son of the oldest brother. I was the late son of the youngest brother. There may have been 45 years between us, so I never could view him as a cousin. He was always uncle to me, and always a little awesome and forbidding, because he had the old world with him. He would come once or twice a year to New York on rabbinic business and stay with us. And I remember, as a little child, sort of sitting in the corner, trying to be like a fly on the wall, listening to my father and Rabbi Breger engage in serious discourse about Judaism and the state of the world. I'm also pleased to be talking about this subject. As Ed Wright pointed out, he had a relationship with Italy, serving as professor of Talmud at the Rabbinical Seminario in Rhodes when it was part of Italy. And during that time, he had close relations with Italian and with Vatican officials, so much so that if you look at the YouTube version of This Is Your Life, which was done with Rabbi Breger, only the old people will remember, like myself, will remember that TV show. You will see that the Vatican was concerned about his welfare during and after World War II and sent emissaries to Arizona to see how he was. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about the Vatican-Israel relationship. It seems like a good time. We're 1 year into the successful pontificate of Pope Francis, so it's a good time to take stock. In discussing this topic, it's necessary first to distinguish the Vatican-Israel relationship, at least initially, from the Catholic-Jewish relationship. As both parties, and in particular the Vatican, are at pains to point out, it is a political relationship, not dependent on spiritual issues. Indeed, when Israel and the Vatican first exchanged ambassadors The initial Israeli choice was a rabbi, and he was rejected by the Vatican specifically for that reason. They didn't want any suggestion that this was a religious relationship. They wanted it to be a political relationship. But in truth, this is a false dichotomy, because as we will see, the Vatican view toward the Jewish state in Palestine evolved together with its theological position towards Judaism. And there never would have been a Vatican-Israel political relationship until the Holy See changed its traditional theological understanding of the Jewish people. Let me first talk a bit about politics under the traditional view. In 1904, Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, met with Pope Pius X. He was meeting with every potentate in Europe at the time to ask for support for the Zionist enterprise. The Pope's report was swift and certain. Quote, "We are unable to favor this movement. We cannot prevent the Jews from going to Jerusalem, but we would never sanction it. The ground of Jerusalem, if it were not always sacred, has been sanctified by the life of Jesus Christ. As the head of the church, I cannot answer you otherwise. The Jews have not recognized our Lord, therefore we cannot recognize the Jewish people." And this continued to be the church's view. For example, they opposed strongly the Balfour Declaration, in which Britain looked, quote, "looked with favor on a Jewish homeland in Palestine." And of course, World War I overturned everyone's thinking. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. The great powers were vying for power in the Middle East. The British secured primacy in Palestine, although the French, I might point out, fought a very bitter rearguard action to maintain at least what they called the French protectorate of Catholics and of Christians in the Middle East. I should make a big footnote here, because it's interesting. The French had managed to wrangle from the Ottomans the view that they would protect all of the Christians, and furthermore, that they would have pride of place at all religious ritual activities at the holy places. And symbolism meaning a lot to the French, they were very strong for that. So much so that even at one point, the British cabinet considered offering the mandate to Palestine to the United States. I don't think they really thought the U.S. would take it, but they just wanted to let the French know that they weren't totally and completely anti-French. They considered the U.S. Anyhow, the result, Britain got the mandate for Palestine. The church focused its concern on a so-called Holy Places Commission, which had been agreed in the Treaty of Versailles, the peace treaty, and was accepted by Britain when they took the mandate. The Holy Places Commission was supposed to deal with the issues of the holy places, particularly the Christian holy places. The problem is the Vatican couldn't develop a position. They hated a Protestant country being in charge of the commission. They disliked having a Jew on the commission. They really hated Greek Orthodox participation, even though the Greek Orthodox was the main Christian sect. The British found they could never put together a commission. If you read the 1923 report on the mandate to the League of Nations, the British saying, we're working on the commission, it's going to be a big deal. By the 24 report, they don't even mention it. So in some respects, the Vatican was stymied by not having a focused political position. In 1936, the Peel Commission, a British High Commission charged with considering the future of Palestine, proposed a kind of It's like 2.5 men, a 2.5 state solution, an Arab state, a Jewish state, and a large city-state of Jerusalem that went from Bethlehem to Nazareth. So really a state that included all Christian interests. The Vatican went behind it, and of course, nothing happened. And we know that after World War II and the Jewish state was created in 1948, still the Vatican arguing for an international solution. They urged it from a theological point of view in the encyclical In Multiplicus Curis. Jerusalem should have an international character as a better guarantee of its freedom. Also in Redemptoris Nostri Cruciatus, my Latin has really gone bad, so forgive me, where they also urged an international solution. I should say that they continue officially to push for an international solution today, but far more nuanced after the changes of the Second Vatican Council, which I'll talk about in a minute. The internationalization of Jerusalem was transformed into the notion that there should be an international statute protecting the interests of all the religious parties, and has even been suggested by the Vatican that Israel has already agreed to international statutes on religious freedom, the UN Convention on Civil and Political Rights, the UNESCO International Convention on Cultural and Historical Property, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, all they have to do is to reaffirm what they've already committed themselves to. So the notion of internationalization, while still from the rhetoric of the Vatican, has really been reduced in its meaning. All this changed, not the internationalization, but everything else, with the Second Vatican Council and the Encyclical Nostra Aetate, which the 50th year is coming up. From the Church's point of view, this was a council really dealing with issues of decentralization and many issues related to the 20th century. From the Jewish point of view, it was all about the Church's relation with the Jews. Number one, the doctrine of supersessionism, that the New Testament superseded the Old Testament, and therefore the Old Testament was irrelevant, was rejected. And as a consequence of that, the notion that historically the Jews, quote, killed Christ, were to blame for killing Christ, was rejected. And further, the Church developed kind of statements to underscore the equality of Judaism. The Jews will remain most dear to God. In a 1985 statement, Judaism is a living religion, and the Hebrew Bible retains its own value as revelation. And in a very remarkable 2002 text, the Jewish people and their sacred scriptures in the Christian Bible, approved, by the way, by then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope, former Pope Benedict XVI. Without the Old Testament, the New Testament would be an indecipherable book, a plant deprived of its roots and destined to dry out. And consider the following. The Jewish expectation for the Messiah is not in vain. It can become for us Christians a strong stimulus to maintain alive the eschatological dimension of our faith, we, like them, live in expectation. This radical transformation of Catholic thought lay the groundwork for major developments in the political relationship, including mutual recognition. Before I speak about the Vatican-Israel agreement, which encapsulated that mutual recognition, I'm going to spend a moment talking about Vatican diplomatic aims, because naturally they have different diplomatic concerns than Israel. First, they worry about the Arab Christian minority. Much of the Church's attitude toward Israel in the 70s, 80s, early 90s of last century was a fear that getting too close to Israel would impact on the Arab Christians living in the Middle East. Now, to some extent, actually to a great extent, that concern has sort of been overwhelmed by what's going on now with ISIS and what went on previously in Iraq with Al-Qaeda and other terror groups. But it still is a concern. And I should note that immediately after signing the Vatican-Israel agreement, which we're going to talk about, they concluded a Vatican PLO agreement, which, by the way, Leonard Hammer is one of the world's experts on. They didn't want to get too distant from the Arab world because they cared about the Christians there. Secondly, now I see. The Church rejects the idea of the clash of civilizations, or at least they certainly want to diffuse any such ideological clash. Its Israel policy of necessity takes this interest into account. Thirdly, the Church places a great deal of importance on adherence to international law. Whether it does so for reasons of international morality or because it has little physical power to deploy in the world arena, so therefore it needs international law, I leave to your judgment. But this concern for UN resolutions and International Court of Justice opinions creates an obvious tension with Israelis who often speak in Ben-Gurion's choice words of shmum to describe the UN, and refer to international law in quotation marks to underscore their view that the international legal system is stacked against the Jewish state. And finally, the Church maintains a very strong practical and theological concern for the integrity of the holy places in Palestine and particularly in Jerusalem. They're interested in protecting the rights of access to holy places, and the Church's interest in pilgrimage. This, of course, was the basis for their internationalization efforts, which failed most immediately in 1948 because neither Israel or Jordan wanted it, and because the U.S. was asked to send 100 boots on the ground to make it happen, and they didn't want to send any boots on the ground. The Church wants the holy places to maintain their spiritual quality. No McDonald's or Pizza Hut across the street from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And this is concerned, they want it to be perhaps like an English cathedral close. One can think of the 1929 Concordat with Italy, where the Vatican termed Rome a, quote, holy city. By the way, the result of which was that you can and get indicted for certain plays in Rome, which you couldn't in Milan, because the holy city, you couldn't blaspheme. That was, of course, changed in the 1984 Concordat to recognize the particular significance Rome has for Christianity. The problem of open access is a very sore point for the Christians. There's clearly access for tourists, but they claim that their own Christian community in the West Bank does not have access. The Israeli answer is security, which has a lot, of course, to speak for itself. But it's hard to imagine that if there were security problems in going to the Western Wall, the Kotel, to pray, someone wouldn't figure out a way to do it. And indeed, some years ago, then Chief Rabbi Bakshi Doron managed to arrange for Christians to go from the Bethlehem, from the, quote, field in Bethlehem, by bus to pray, all in a bus, so that the security operation could be taken into account. But there's not a lot of creative thinking. These four concerns were part of what the Vatican had in its quiver in negotiating the fundamental agreement. Fundamental agreement is the key to present-day Vatican-Israel relations. It deals with a whole range of issues, some of concern to the Church, some to Israel. Bluntly, it's front-ended. It gives Israel recognition at the beginning. The Curia, the Vatican diplomats hated that idea. But Pope John Paul said, I want to get an agreement, and pushed it through. This recognition held great symbolic significance and had meaning for countries with large Catholic populations. But as we will see, the promise of the agreement has not been fully realized. Let me first review some of its specifics. Article 1 restates Israel's commitment to uphold and observe freedom of religion and conscience, because Israel had committed to that in various international documents. Article 2 raises important issues for Jews. It refers to the Jewish people in a religious context, which affirms the post-Vatican II acceptance of the religious life of Judaism. It addresses the need for both Church and Israel to cooperate in combating anti-Semitism, and very importantly, condemnation of anti-Semitism refers not only to discrimination against Jews as a religious group, but against Jews as a people, recognizing Jewish peoplehood. Further articles affirm Israel's commitment to, quote, maintain and respect the, quote, the status quo in the Christian holy places, recognize the interests of both church and synagogue in, quote, favoring Christian pilgrimage, although it doesn't speak of the right to pilgrimage, and commits both parties to give full effect to the legal personality of the church in Israel, something the church was very concerned with, legal personality. Prior to that, if the church had to be in the ownership of the a church had to be in the ownership of the priest, because the Catholic Church had no legal personality. So this was a big breakthrough for the church, and they reaffirmed their right to maintain and direct schools and institutions in harmony with the state's right to regulate the field of education. I should say a bit of a footnote about recognize the status quo. The status quo refers to a collection of Ottoman firmans, call them executive orders in modern term, where the Ottomans gave different rights and protections to Christian sects. S-E-C-T-S, not S-E-X. Don't get too excited. The firmans reflected, to be blunt, the political position of the Ottoman Empire at the time. When they were getting a big punch from Russia, they would issue a firman that favored the Greeks. When they were getting a punch from France, they would issue a firman that favored the Roman Catholics. In the Treaty of Paris that ended the Crimean War, for the first time internationally, the firmans were recognized as the status quo, meaning keep things as they are. And in the Treaty of Berlin, a treaty in the 1870s, the same thing. And when the British took the mandate, the same thing. Israel did not recognize the status quo simply because some of the issues in the status quo were kind of discriminatory to Jews. But they did reaffirm freedom of religion. And in this agreement with the Vatican, for the first time, they recognized the status quo. This is very big for the Christian sects because they wrap themselves all the time in the status quo. I can go on for hours about the status quo, but let's just say that from the Catholic and from the Christian point of view, it's a main source of what they view of as their rights in the Holy Land. I mean, so much so, just to give you one little joke, they refuse, the French priests refused to pay taxes on cars because one of the firmans, these Ottoman executive orders, gave them rights to bring in wagons without paying tax. By the way, the Israeli government does not agree to this, but the foreign ministry pays the customs for their cars, so as not to have a big debate. And this is true in many other issues. Now, they can't always deal with private contracts. Recently, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre had forgotten about paying water bills, and the water company turned their water off, and there was a big brouhaha. The churches claimed the status quo. Ultimately, guess what, folks? The Israeli government came in and said, we'll take care of the past. You just deal with the future. So we'll see what happens with the future. So Israeli recognition of status quo, big deal. Now, I should add that Article 11 is of particular importance. The Holy See states, quote, it is solemnly committed to remaining a stranger to all merely temporal conflicts, which in principle apply specifically to disputed territories and unsettled borders. This is high-sounding language that the church is not going to, officially, will not take sides on what the borders of Jerusalem should be, or a future Palestinian state. I don't know how closely that's been adhered to, but it created the kind of consternation among the Arab countries that led very quickly to this agreement, Vatican PLO agreement. Now, the accord, which was signed at the very end, December 31st of 1993, called for two working groups to conclude the final issues. One about legal personality and the other financial. The legal personality was first. It took 6, 7 years. It took intervention from American congressmen, but finally the legal personality was approved. The financial agreement is still being negotiated. The financial basket, they call it. 3 issues. One is taxes, money. Basically, the Ottomans didn't tax any kind of church activity, a church gift shop, convent hotel, church, no tax, which of course is not the American view, which a church is supposed to pay tax on its gift shop. If it runs a hotel, it's supposed to pay tax. But that was the Ottoman view. It was the British view. And Israel wanted to change that. The church wrapped itself in the status quo. Israel's problem was that if it gave more benefits to the church than it did to Jewish religious institutions, they would be held to pay internally. So it was very hard for them to accept the church's position, although they in these negotiations, have gone a long way toward it. A second concern is a somewhat esoteric one, and I'll try to be brief. It's what due process. Decisions about holy places in 1924 were taken out of the courts and given to the executive in the so-called 1924 Order in Council. The British felt that holy places issues were too hot and they were too political to leave to the courts, so they brought it into the executive. This is also true for present-day Israel. The Order in Council continues. The Israelis developed a system where they set up a special commission to consider a holy place dispute. These commissions are pretty political. There's been a dispute since 1970 between the Egyptian Copts and the Ethiopian Amharics. I just have to tell you this because it's so funny. The Amharics went out of some church near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which they had been given control of, and the Copts changed the locks. And the Amharics moved on the roof. And the Israeli government pulled it out of the courts, set up a commission. The commission has met twice since 1970. So why? Because Israel hasn't wanted to offend Egypt or the Ethiopians. So the Amharics are still living on the roof, and the commission continues every couple of decades to have a desultory meeting. So the church doesn't like this. So they wanted some kind of arbitration procedure that they felt was due process, using, let's say, legal rules, using retired Supreme Court justice. So that's a second area of dispute. The third area is property. Certain church property was taken in 1948 for military purposes, others for 1967 for military purposes. Some church property is, quote, abandoned property because, as I said, it was owned by the church was owned by the priest, the Arab priest, skedaddled, and so the property was taken as abandoned enemy property. And the church was trying to get this back. They have had some successes. the Notre Dame building in Jerusalem, huge, important building right across from the King's Hotel and the Plaza Hotel, was returned. Some other buildings were returned, but it's tough slogging. Also, there is a huge dispute over the Cenacle. The Cenacle, which is considered by Christian tradition to be the site of the Last Supper, is also in the basement of the diaspora yeshiva on Mount Zion. Tension. The church has use of it now once or twice a year, and on special occasions. I had the privilege, when I was accompanying Justice Scalia, Antonin Scalia, to Israel, they got special permission for him to look at it. The church, the problem here is that however the church feels wrong, they can't blame Israel, because the Cenacle was taken from them in the 16th century by a sultan who was annoyed at the Franciscans and given to an Arab waqf, an Arab religious trust. So therefore, their complaint is really against the Arab religious trust. I don't want to be totally clear here, because to be technical, it was a, quote, private waqf, not a public waqf, and as a private waqf for trust, it was abandoned in 1948, so Israel held it as abandoned property. In any event, since the Franciscans are among the top negotiators, they're hot to get the Cenacle back. They're not hot. They realize that they'll never get the ownership back. They want the use. They want to be able to pray there. And this has become a huge political football. Every time it looks like they're close to an agreement, there are social media and newspaper articles in the far right and the religious right, Israel giving up sacred property. Of course, the diaspora yeshiva is fueling that, because they're not too keen on giving this up. There's been a lot of progress, we're told. For example, the church wants to rebuild a destroyed, abandoned and taken and destroyed church in Caesarea. Originally, Israel said no. Now they will allow them to build a church in the Caesarea Park, as long as it doesn't look like a church. So they can do that. There's a lot of discussion about giving the church more use of the Cenacle, although that, as I say, creates hot water every time it's mentioned. And there's been some discussion about other church property. In 2013, there was lots of leaks, 90% done, ready to roll. But as 214 continued and ended, these leaks have really stopped. And now, while they're meeting twice a year, the negotiating team, each communique is the same as the communique before. So there's not a sense of much progress. There is a feeling that the shift in Israel and the growing strains of nationalist sentiment in the religious parties makes it very difficult for the Israeli government to make a deal on these subjects. Also, to be very blunt, it was people like Perez and people from the Labor Party who are very interested and kind of from their own history committed to European civilization, and they're the ones who are most interested in making a kind of agreement with the Vatican. So as the nationalists, the religious parties are less interested in that, the pressure for an agreement ends. Now, there's some outstanding issues. Oh, and I have to say something else, and unfortunately critical of Israel. The fundamental agreement was signed by both parties in 1993. During the negotiations, the Israelis said it's a self-executing agreement, which it means, in kind of layman's terms, that it doesn't require to be approved, let's say, by, if it was a U.S. treaty, by Congress. There's no implementing legislation. After the treaty, they say they need implementing legislation. And by the way, they certainly do for the legal personality side, and they certainly do for the tax side, because it changes the tax law. Israel has not brought the treaty that's parts already agreed to, the treaty itself, the Fundamental Court, and the legal personality agreement, to the Knesset. And in fact, in 2004, in a court case, the Ministry of Justice said, oh, we're not controlled by the Fundamental Agreement. It's not part of Israeli law. I have to say that Israel is probably in breach of international, quote, law, unquote, as regards this point, because there is a duty in the Vienna Convention on treaties that if you sign a treaty, you've got to do best efforts to effectuate it. That, by the way, is why President Bush revoked U.S. support for the ICC, the International Criminal Court, right before it was going to take effect, because he didn't want to be in a position of having agreed to the International Criminal Court and then doing nothing to ratify it, or indeed hindering ratification in the U.S. It also tells you something else psychologically, that it's not clear that the Israelis really view this as a, quote, treaty, more as a kind of series of aspirations. The Vatican, of course, views concordats as treaties. Most international lawyers would view them as concordats being these religious agreements. Most international lawyers would view them as treaties. One example of how this has hindered the use of the treaty, I mentioned the article that says that the Vatican will help Israel on anti-Semitism. Israel has never called upon the Vatican to do so. It has called upon the Vatican to condemn anti-Semitism in various places, like the Ukraine, but it's never done so using the treaty, because it hasn't wanted to build up the treaty. Secondly, there's an article for cultural relations. The Vatican has done a great deal in terms of bringing artifacts from the Vatican Library to Israel on the 800th birth of Maimonides. They brought some unbelievable Maimonides manuscripts. I was privileged to see them in the Vatican Library in a special tour that was arranged, and they're just, you know, beyond awesome. His handwritten manuscripts. They have also digitalized the manuscripts they hold and published what the art critics call a catalog raisonné, or like total, complete catalog of the Hebrew manuscripts. None of this was done with reference to the fundamental agreement. But this is one of the articles. This is something that could have been made use of. Now, I'm going to be brief to allow some questions. There are outstanding issues beyond the treaty. One of the biggest one is visas. The church has a lot of problems getting visas for religious personnel. By the way, not just the Catholic Church. And even like pro-Japanese, pro-Zionist Japanese religious groups can't get visas. This was started 20 years ago when Shas controlled the Interior Ministry. They were worried about Russians coming in who were not 100% halakhically Jewish. You can imagine how that continued to Christians who they thought would proselytize. This situation has gotten better, but still big problems. Just as one example, the Anglican Bishop of Jerusalem, Anglican, was refused a visa. He had to leave every 6 months and come back on a tourist visa. Maybe he wouldn't get it. A lot of religious personnel leave, and then they come back and they're refused. That was sorted out after Britain and Australia and other Anglican countries had a cow and, just told Israel to stop it. There's a problem with new churches for Hebrew-speaking Christians. There are a lot of Hebrew-speaking Christians, many of them Russians, who came under the law of return. You're Jewish, which of course is a question halachically if the Russians who came were all halachically Jewish. But you can bring your wife, who may not be Jewish, her parents who may not be, if she's not Jewish, they're definitely not Jewish. So there are a lot of Russians who came who not only want to eat pork, but want to pray on Christian holidays. They've learned Hebrew. The church opened a Hebrew-speaking, quote, division. I'm not an expert on the kind of internal law of the church. It's not like a full diocese, but it's a division. Also, there are a lot of guest workers from the Philippines, legal and illegal, who are Catholics, from Romania, etc. They want a place to pray. It's almost impossible to get permission to build new churches. There's a problem the church has with the security wall. That's the fence. In Jerusalem, it's a wall. In other places, it's a fence. Because the wall can cut off a Catholic school from the people, from the young people who would otherwise go to the school. Here, I think the church is a little unfair, actually a lot unfair, because anywhere you move the wall, there are going to be some people in, some people out, some Christians in, some people out. So really, the church critique is an attack on the wall, not an attack on the way in which the wall has meandered, you might say. It's a much broader attack than the Israeli Supreme Court, who said the wall should have some proportion between improving security and hurting the local population. Because Christians will be hurt either way. I mean, the wall goes here, Christians will be hurt. The wall goes there, Christians will be hurt. Nonetheless, this is a tension. And again, by the way, the Congress butts in, and usually after they butt in, Israel agrees to make some special exception, a special door for the students going to the convent school, etc. There's a problem with police protection. All of the churches wrote a letter some years ago saying they don't get police protection. There's a special problem, unfortunately, with attacks on church figures in the Old City. The Armenians have a really tough time. The Armenian quarter is cheek by jowl to the Jewish quarter. The ultra-Orthodox or nationalists living in the Jewish quarter spit on the Armenians. They once attacked the Armenian patriarch. Almost all the Armenians say that they expect to be spat at when they leave the church. Recently, a novitiate, an Armenian novitiate who used to be a boxer, got attacked, and he engaged in self-defense. And then when he was arrested, he was acquitted under self-defense. So this is not usual for church personnel, but it may be a future trend of dealing with this informally. From the point of view of Israel, the Vatican has been too even-handed in attacking terror. And this was very clear in the Gaza campaign. If we're going to go forward, I think the Israelis have to take the bilateral agreement seriously. It's the political will to resolve the financial package. I mean, the technocrats tell me, you know, we've made the deal, but it requires political will to push it through. For its side, the Vatican has to recognize it's more than a bilateral legal relationship and be concerned about the broader impact. Here's where I say Catholic, Jewish, and Vatican Israel relate. Be concerned about the broader impact of its actions on the Jews. I'll get into trouble. I'll say the Jews have to realize, the Jewish organizations, that they have a kind of neurotic relationship with the church. I mean, the church says we're sorry, and the Jews say you're not sorry enough, and then jump. So the church says, well, we jumped, we've done this, and they say jump higher. So at some point, the church is going to say we've done what we can. In fact, there's some evidence that they may have already reached that point in terms of they still talk with the Jewish organizations, but they're not really moving forward on a lot of things that Jewish organizations are concerned about. So the relationship, while strong from the Catholic Jewish point of view, and I can go through all of the problems, but because of the transformation of Vatican II is strong. There's no American Catholic seminary which doesn't teach that Jesus was a Jew. And that in itself is an unbelievable difference from past history. But if the relationship is to continue, there has to be stronger effort to resolve the bilateral political issues and hopefully end up signing the accord. Thank you very much.